Okay, welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at some Facebook posts made by somebody that I used to know back in my high school days who went down a far right and stupid rabbit hole. and, you know, I like to debunk his nonsense claims. So this time I was looking at his Facebook wall and there was a post from Judicial Watch, which is an organization that has a legitimate sounding name, but their purpose is in many ways not particularly legitimate. So their post says, quote, "The gravy train is over. HUD, DHS team up to end subsidized public housing for illegal immigrants." The post continues, "New! Over half of illegal immigrant households in the United States use at least one taxpayer funded welfare program, according to congressional testimony provided recently by the Center for Immigration Studies, or CIS." So let me interrupt here that post from Judicial Watch and note that the CIS is a very controversial organization. So I'll get more into that in a second. But anyway, Judicial Watch continues, and it costs the government tens of billions of dollars, establishing that clamping down on the unprecedented flow of migrants is only the first step to mitigate the damage of the Biden administration's disastrous open border policies. Another standard right wing claim. This is me talking right now. Um, they always say there was an open border when there actually wasn't. It's just that there's a process by which you're supposed to hear individual cases and not treat them all as if they are the same case. They are not all the same. Therefore, you don't process all these people as if they are a singular group. So that's why, there are different stories to be told here from the one that Judicial Watch is trying to say, because they don't want to see these migrants, as they call them, as individuals, but they are just a group. And of course, the only thing that matters to these bigots is that they are immigrants, that it doesn't matter that these people have, individual personalities, they have different professions, perhaps, they have different circumstances and interests and concerns, all of those basic facts about them. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whatsoever. And we're finding out that as time goes on, plenty of innocent people are being swept up in these raids that are going on, including, in some cases, people who are legally here. You know, they still have found themselves shipped off to this work camp prison in El Salvador. And a sensible American might ask, well, why are we sending people to El Salvador? That's a little bit odd. Why is there a relationship for us to do that with any country for that matter? You know, but it's happening anyway. Judicial Watch continues. One major area of concern is government subsidized public housing, which became available to illegal aliens under policies established by the previous administration's Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. So that's the end of Judicial Watch's um, their post. So who stole affordable housing, though? Hint: it was not immigrants who did that. So this post is flawed on multiple levels. So I'm going to break it down for you in case you need that to be done. So, for starters, it misrepresents the reality of public housing and immigration status. Judicial Watch claims that quote unquote illegal immigrants have been receiving subsidized housing due to HUD policies. However, federal law has long prohibited undocumented immigrants from receiving federal housing assistance. This is nothing new. The only scenario in which undocumented people might be in public housing is if they live in mixed status families, where some family members, like children or spouses, are U.S. citizens or legal residents. Cutting off these families from assistance punishes citizens and legal residents too. So the framing of illegal immigrants getting benefits is misleading, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, it promotes state violence and scarcity myths. So it enforces artificial scarcity to justify exclusion and control. Public housing is underfunded not because of immigrants, but because the state and capitalists prioritize profit over human needs. The US government always has billions for war, cops, and corporate bailouts, but claims it can't provide housing for everyone. That's the real problem right there. It is skewed priorities. I think I think the real problem is that the U.S. government always has money for things that harm people, but when it comes to helping people, it's like, oh no, we can't actually do that. We can't do that. Here, blame the immigrants for our inability to help, or blame trans kids, or you know, trans athletes, or some stupid shit along those lines. Point number three, it uses a right wing think tank as an authority. And I told you to, listen for this part because this is one of the scariest parts of this episode. So the post by Judicial Watch cites the quote Center for Immigration Studies, end quote. That's what they call themselves, or CIS. Well, actually, that's a group with deep ties to white nationalist and anti immigrant ideologies. CIS was founded by John Tanton, a eugenicist and a person who promoted white nationalist policies and talking points. He has had deep ties to such figures. So this is not a neutral source, nor is it a factual based source. It's part of a broader propaganda machine that pushes state repression and xenophobia as a matter of course. If there's any facts that challenge their xenophobia, they're likely, well, they'll undoubtedly be swept under the rug. So, yeah, I would not trust anything that comes from the Center for Immigration Studies, which actually has a neutral sounding title, but they're anything but that. So, point number four, the post from Judicial Watch distracts from the real enemies, which, I mean, buckle up because we're going for a ride here. Landlords, capitalists, and yes, to some degree, the state. So instead of blaming immigrants, anarchists, and the like, the real problem here is the landlords and real estate speculators who are making housing unaffordable for so many people. Public housing has been gutted for decades because of privatization, gentrification, and the government's refusal to challenge the power of these big landlords and developers. Now, that's just a fact. Immigration has nothing to do with it, or for the most part, it doesn't. It's about power and who controls land and resources. And these, you know, landless people coming from, Mexico or elsewhere who lack resources and money, they're not in control of land and resources. They don't control the housing. They don't set the prices. They're not even allowed to. So, I mean, to blame them for all of this, people who are literally less powerful than I am. It's just preposterous, but that is precisely why they are blamed, because it's really a way to keep these people further down than they might be otherwise, and to culturally craft a narrative wherein people who actually do not have much of any power are blamed for how others mismanage the land and the resources. So if you can scapegoat a group that actually has very little power, I won't say no power, but very little power, well, then you're manipulating people. And I think these interests actually get off on the lies that they spread too. There's a sense of power over the population, and they probably feel a certain amount of pleasure from knowing that they're hoodwinking the masses as they scapegoat the relatively less powerful. So, point number 5, the gravy train is over, but for whom? The real gravy train is actually corporate welfare, tax breaks for the rich, and subsidies for police and military spending. And, for the millionaires and billionaires. So, working class people, immigrants and non immigrants alike, are struggling while billionaires hoard wealth. Judicial Watch isn't against corp- corporate or government handouts. They just want them to go to the rich, to the cops, border patrol, and the military, not as much to working class people who they view as their natural enemies. So the takeaway here is that the real solution isn't clamping down on immigration. It's actually either, reforming or even abolishing borders, seeing housing as a human right, and dismantling the worst aspects of the capitalist system that keep people in poverty, and that let a relatively small group of people hoard a bunch of money and resources and land and property and special privileges and rights. So we know the border is an imaginary line because Trump himself made that argument not that long ago while advancing the idea of stealing Canada, either militarily or otherwise. Trump justified it by referring to the Canada United States border as an artificial line. Those are the words that he used. Mind you, it's not me saying that, it's him. So he really just gave the game away there. That should have definitely made more national headlines, but the mainstream media sucks ass, so they didn't go over that. So this is Trump telling you right to your dumb face that it's an artificial line. That's his word, you know. And he even added a little bit humorously that it looks like it was drawn, looks like it was done with a ruler. So he knows that these borders are actually fake. He knows that. He's telling you that. And you're still believing that they're actually things that should be taken seriously. And I've long made this argument for many years. If the United States government actually believed in borders, if it wasn't stomping around the globe, invading all of these different countries, overthrowing leaders, funding terrorist groups and backing dictators and all that kind of stuff. If it wasn't doing all of that, then it might be able to seriously, talk about how important borders are. But instead, it wants to have the ability to do whatever it wants, you know, regardless of borders, while everybody else who has less money and power, they're left scrambling in the wake of whatever these powerful interests end up doing. So it's really like a game to these people, you know, the powerful who really want to impose these ideological distinctions between people, and it might be the difference between nations, or It could be a racial difference, religious difference, whatever. All of these hierarchical groups, they are poised to potentially abuse their their own populations for one thing, but definitely external populations as well. So yeah, keep that in mind. They're actually giving the game away, and a lot of these people who were acting as if they were experts on the U.S. Constitution, now they're just scrapping the Constitution. They're mocking the very premise of due process, which you're supposed to have not just as a legal citizen, but as somebody who is interacting with our society. You're supposed to be uh, having some sort of process where you can look at the evidence, look at the actual likelihood of guilt or innocence. I mean, there is a standard here where you're not just supposed to be dealing with empty claims. You're supposed to have the claims against somebody having evidence that is tied with them. That's supposed to be substantial. You're supposed to be able to make a case. So that's why when I've said in the past that I'm in favor of general amnesty, it kind of means just that. If there is evidence that somebody is, like a serial killer or something like that, then okay, present that as a reason why they should be barred from entering a country, and of course why they should be prosecuted. The artificial line, being crossed, that should not be the you know the main issue here. Where somebody happened to be born just because of their parents or whatever that they have no control over. That's a ridiculous standard in the first place. I had no power over where I happened to be born. Why should that be the main trick? uh, but it is a trick, it really is. And we've seen that they've further made a mockery of this whole process by Trump is letting people move into the United States and become permanent citizens if they pay like millions of dollars or something like that. From what I understand, so it's just a way for the rich to gain more money and power. To have these kinds of standards. So I'm not necessarily against every element of a border. If you want to have checkpoints for this or that, I suppose society at large could have those. But at the end of the day, if the people implementing that are hypocritical as hell, and again, they're stomping around the globe, bombing foreign populations and whatnot, that's a bit hypocritical to say you can't cross the line in the sand, but I can, just because I'm in this high office. Suddenly I'm able to do drone strikes or, you know, be in league with dictators and, you know, all of these disreputable things, the things that in my mind are far worse than somebody just coming into another country looking for a job or something. You know, one is a little bit worse than the other. And so instead of accepting the state's false scarcity narrative, we should fight for community controlled housing, tenant unions, and an end to these monopolistic landlordism practices. The enemy isn't immigrants, it's the state and capitalists who create artificial scarcity and enforce it through violence.